The crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed through the dusty courthouse square like a gunshot, and Ruth Smith felt her world shatter into 1,000 pieces. She clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, the baby's tiny fists tangled in the worn fabric of her dress as curious eyes, in cruel whispers, surrounded them on all sides. "What am I bid for this young woman and child?" The auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathered crowd. "Strong back, good for household work, and the infant comes with her naturally." Ruth's legs trembled as she stood there, exposed and vulnerable, her baby Emma making soft cooing sounds against her shoulder. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town, casting harsh shadows across the faces of men who looked at her like she was nothing more than livestock. She had never imagined it would come to this. 3 months ago, she had been a wife and mother, living in a modest cabin with her husband David on the outskirts of town. But consumption had taken him swiftly and without mercy, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and a landlord who had no patience for a widow's tears. When the bank had foreclosed on their property and she couldn't find work that would allow her to keep baby Emma with her, the town council had made their decision. Indentured servitude, they called it. The reality felt much more like slavery. "Do I hear $20?" the auctioneer called out. A portly merchant near the front raised his hand lazily. "20 for the woman, but I don't want the brat. Can't have crying babies disturbing my customers." Ruth's heart clenched as murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was her worst fear realized, the nightmare that had kept her awake for weeks. They would separate her from Emma, sell her to one master, and send her daughter to another, or worse, to the orphanage. Now, the auctioneer chuckled. "The child stays with the mother, that's the arrangement. Package deal, gentlemen." "Then $15, the merchant countered. "Extra mouth to feed brings down the value." Other voices joined in, haggling over her worth like she was farm equipment. Ruth closed her eyes and tried to block out their words, focusing instead on the warm weight of her daughter in her arms. $25. The new voice cut through the chatter like a knife, deep and gravelly, with an authority that made the crowd turn. Ruth opened her eyes and saw him for the first time. He stood at the back of the gathering, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His face was weathered and serious, with intense blue eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Most of the townspeople gave him a wide berth, she noticed, stepping aside as he moved closer to the platform. Well, the auctioneer said, his tone shifting to something more respectful. "Matthew Turner, haven't seen you in town for quite some time." "Been busy," the man replied simply, his gaze never leaving Ruth's face. $30, called out another voice from the crowd. "50, Matthew Turner said without hesitation. A murmur went through the gathered people. $50 was more than most of them made in 2 months. Ruth stared at this stranger who was bidding on her life with such calm determination. $50 is the bid, the auctioneer announced. "Any other offers?" The crowd shuffled and whispered, but no one else spoke up. $50 was serious money, and Matthew Turner had a reputation that made even the boldest men think twice about crossing him. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with finality, and Ruth felt her knees nearly give way. Sold to Matthew Turner for $50. As the crowd began to disperse, Matthew approached the platform with steady steps. Up close, Ruth could see the lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting against mountain sun and wind. His hands, when he offered one to help her down from the platform, were calloused and strong but surprisingly gentle. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of something that might have been kindness. Ruth hesitated for a moment, then took his hand and allowed him to help her down. Emma stirred in her arms but didn't wake. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking him for. "My wagon's just over there," Matthew said, nodding toward a sturdy-looking conveyance hitched to 2 strong horses. "We've got a bit of a ride ahead of us." As they walked through the thinning crowd, Ruth caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Living up in those mountains all alone. Heard he killed a man once. That poor woman doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." The words sent a chill down her spine, but when she glanced up at Matthew's profile, she saw only quiet concentration as he guided her toward the wagon. Whatever rumors surrounded him, he had done something no one else had been willing to do. He had kept her and Emma together. The wagon was loaded with supplies, bags of flour and salt, tools and blankets, everything a man might need for a long winter in the wilderness. Matthew helped her up onto the seat, his touch careful and respectful, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Where are we going?" Ruth asked as the wagon lurched into motion. "My cabin," Matthew replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "About 2 hours up into the mountains. It's isolated, but it's safe." Safe. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning she didn't yet understand. As the town fell away behind them and the road began to climb into the foothills, Ruth found herself studying her new master's profile. His jaw was set with determination, but there was something else there, something that looked almost like pain. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned as they climbed higher, and the air grew cooler and thinner. Emma woke briefly, fussing until Ruth was able to nurse her discreetly beneath her shawl. Throughout it all, Matthew kept his eyes respectfully forward, giving them privacy without being asked. "She's a pretty baby," he said quietly when Emma had settled back to sleep. "Thank you," Ruth replied, surprised by the genuine warmth in his voice. "Her name is Emma." Matthew nodded. "And you're Ruth?" "Ruth Smith," she confirmed, then hesitated. "What should I call you?" "Matthew's fine," he said, "or Matt, if you prefer." The formality of it struck her as odd. Most masters would expect to be called Sir, or Meister, at the very least. But Matthew Turner seemed different from other men she had known. The road grew narrower as they climbed, winding through stands of tall pines and across rushing streams. Ruth had never been this far from the town before, and the wild beauty of the landscape was both breathtaking and intimidating. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," he agreed. "Peaceful, too. No one bothers you up here, long as you know how to take care of yourself." The wagon rounded a bend, and suddenly Ruth could see their destination. Matthew's cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, smoke rising from its stone chimney. It was larger than she had expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide front porch and several outbuildings scattered around the property. "It's not much," Matthew said as he guided the wagon up the final stretch, "but it's home." Ruth stared at the cabin with growing wonder. After months of uncertainty and fear, the sight of this solid, permanent dwelling filled her with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Matthew brought the wagon to a stop and helped Ruth and Emma down. As her feet touched the ground, Ruth felt a strange sense of arrival. "Let me show you inside," Matthew said, taking her small bundle of possessions. "You and the baby must be tired from the journey." The cabin's interior was a revelation. Ruth had expected something rough and primitive, but Matthew's home was warm and well-appointed, with sturdy furniture and shelves lined with books. A fire crackled in the large stone fireplace. "There's a bedroom back there," Matthew said, nodding toward a doorway at the rear of the cabin. "It's yours now. I'll sleep out here on the settee." Ruth stared at him in surprise. "I don't understand. You're giving me your bedroom?" "A woman needs privacy," Matthew replied matter-of-factly, "especially a woman with a baby. The room has everything you'll need, and there's a cradle by the bed that I made it some time ago." Before she could ask, Matthew was already moving toward the door. "I'll bring in the supplies and let you get settled. There's stew in the pot if you're hungry and fresh bread in the cupboard. Make yourself at home." Ruth made her way to the bedroom Matthew had indicated. It was a comfortable space with a large bed covered in colorful quilts, a dresser with a mirror, and yes, a beautifully crafted wooden cradle positioned near the window. The cradle was clearly handmade, carved with intricate designs of flowers and vines, and lined with soft blankets. Ruth sank down on the edge of the bed, Emma still sleeping peacefully in her arms. Nothing about this situation made sense. Matthew Turner had paid $50 for her indenture, then immediately given her the best room in his house. He had spoken to her with respect, treated her with kindness, and shown no sign of the cruel intentions she had feared. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Ruth, I brought your things?" She opened the door to find Matthew standing there with her bundle in a concerned expression. "Are you all right?" he asked. "You look pale." "I'm confused," Ruth replied. "I don't understand what you want from me." Matthew set her bundle on the dresser and turned to face her. "I want you to take care of yourself and your baby," he said simply. That's all. But the indenture papers, what kind of work do you expect me to do? Whatever you're comfortable with, Matthew replied. Cooking, if you like to cook. Mending, if you're good with a needle. But nothing you don't want to do, and nothing that would put you or Emma at risk. Ruth searched his face for some sign of deception. But all she saw was sincerity and something that looked almost like sadness. Why, she whispered. Why did you buy my indenture? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the cradle by the window. When he spoke, his voice was soft. I had a wife once, he said, and a daughter. They died 3 winters ago. Fever took them both. I made that cradle for my little girl, but she never got to use it. The words hit Ruth like a physical blow, explaining so much in an instant. The sadness in his eyes, the careful way he had treated her and Emma, the cradle that had been waiting in an empty room. I'm sorry, she said and meant it. I'm so sorry for your loss. Matthew nodded, his jaw tight with old pain. When I saw you up there on that platform holding your baby and heard those men talking about separating you, he shook his head. No one should have to go through that. No child should be taken from her mother. Understanding dawned on Ruth. Matthew Turner hadn't bought her indenture out of need or desire. He had bought it out of compassion, out of his own deep understanding of loss and love. The townspeople, Ruth said slowly, they say you killed a man. I did, Matthew replied without flinching. The man who sold my wife and daughter medicine that turned out to be nothing but colored water and false promises. He took my money and their lives, and when I confronted him about it, he drew a gun. I was faster. The simple honesty of his confession was somehow more reassuring than any denial would have been. Matthew Turner was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, who had chosen justice over law when the two came into conflict. Thank you, Ruth said, and this time she knew exactly what she was thanking him for. Thank you for keeping us together. Matthew nodded once, then stepped back toward the door. Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow. As the door closed behind him, Ruth looked around the room that was now hers. For the first time in months, she felt something that had been absent from her life for so long, she had almost forgotten what it felt like. She felt safe. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ruth woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood and Matthew's voice as he spoke to his horses in the yard outside. Emma was still sleeping peacefully in the beautiful cradle, and for a moment Ruth simply lay there, marveling at the quiet contentment of the scene. A gentle knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Ruth, I've made coffee if you'd like some. She rose quickly and dressed, then lifted Emma from the cradle and made her way to the main room. Matthew stood at the stove, pouring steaming coffee into 2 thick ceramic mugs. Thank you, Ruth said, accepting the mug gratefully. I hope I didn't wake you, Matthew said. I'm usually up before dawn. You didn't wake me, Ruth assured him. Emma's an early riser too. They stood in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee while Emma gurgled contentedly in Ruth's arms. I've been thinking, Matthew said eventually, about what we discussed yesterday, about your work here. Ruth tensed slightly, waiting for the real terms of her indenture to be revealed. I don't need much, Matthew continued. I've been taking care of myself up here for 3 years now. But if you wanted to help with the cooking, I wouldn't say no. I'm not much of a cook, and I imagine you'd like to feel useful. I would, Ruth said, relief flooding through her. I enjoy cooking, actually. Then it's settled, Matthew said with a small smile. You can take over the kitchen, and I'll handle the outdoor work. Fair enough? Ruth nodded, then hesitated. What about Emma? She'll need attention throughout the day. Bring her with you, Matthew said simply, or leave her in the cradle if she's sleeping. Whatever works best for both of you. The casualness of his response caught Ruth off guard. Most employers would have seen a baby as an inconvenience. You're very kind, Ruth said softly. Matthew shook his head. I'm practical. A happy baby means a happy mother, and a happy mother means better cooking. There was humor in his voice that made Ruth smile despite herself. Well then, she said, setting down her coffee mug, I suppose I should get started. What do you usually have for breakfast? Whatever's easiest, Matthew replied. Biscuits, And bacon, mostly. Ruth looked around the well-stocked kitchen, noting the bags of flour and cornmeal, the hanging bunches of dried herbs, the rows of preserved vegetables in glass jars. "I can do better than biscuits and bacon," she said with growing confidence. "Experiment away," Matthew said. "I'll be outside working if you need anything." The morning flew by as Ruth lost herself in the familiar rhythms of cooking. She made cornbread studded with dried berries, fried eggs and bacon, and even managed to whip up a pot of creamy grits. The aromas filled the cabin, making it smell like home. When Matthew came in for the noon meal, his eyes widened at the sight of the table, set with real plates and napkins, a small wildflower centerpiece, and more food than he probably ate in 2 days. "This is," he began, then stopped, apparently at a loss for words. "Too much?" Ruth asked anxiously. "No," Matthew said quickly. "It's perfect. It's been a long time since this place felt like a home instead of just a place to sleep." They sat down to eat together, Emma sleeping peacefully nearby. Matthew ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting every dish. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "My mother," Ruth replied. "She believed that cooking was one of the most important skills a woman could have, not just for feeding a family, but for creating a sense of home and belonging." "She was a wise woman," Matthew said. "She was," Ruth agreed. "She died when I was 16. After that, it was just me and my father until I married David." "That must have been hard," Matthew said gently. Ruth nodded, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. "What about your parents?" she asked. Matthew's expression darkened slightly. "They're both gone now. My father died in the war, and my mother passed 2 years ago. She never approved of my choice to live in the mountains." "Were you running away?" Ruth asked softly. Matthew considered the question seriously. "Maybe at first," he admitted. "After Sarah and little Mary died, I couldn't stand being around people. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about running away and started being about finding peace." "And did you find peace?" "Some," Matthew said. "And now," he gestured around the table, "now I'm thinking maybe there are different kinds of peace." The conversation was interrupted by Emma waking with a soft cry. Ruth rose to tend to her, but Matthew held up a hand. "Finish your meal," he said. "I can hold her for a minute if she'll let me." Ruth hesitated, then carefully placed Emma in Matthew's strong arms. The baby looked tiny against his broad chest, but he held her with surprising confidence. "Hello there, little one," he murmured, his voice taking on a gentle quality Ruth hadn't heard before. Emma gazed up at him with wide, curious eyes, apparently fascinated by this new face. "She likes you," Ruth observed. "She's a good baby," Matthew replied, gently rocking Emma. "Reminds me of my Mary at this age." There was pain in his voice, but also something else, something that looked almost like healing. The days that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Ruth would wake each morning to the sound of Matthew already at work outside, tend to Emma's needs, then begin preparing breakfast. Matthew would come in hungry and appreciative, full of quiet compliments and gentle questions about her day. After breakfast, he would return to his outdoor tasks while Ruth cleaned the cabin, did mending, or simply sat by the fire with Emma, reading from Matthew's extensive collection of books. When Emma napped, Ruth would often find herself lost in stories of far-off places. Matthew never pressured her to do more than she was comfortable with, never made demands or set rigid schedules. If Emma was fussy and needed extra attention, he would simply take over meal preparation without complaint. It was, Ruth realized with growing amazement, the most peaceful and contented she had ever been. Even during her marriage to David, there had been constant worry about money. Here in Matthew's mountain sanctuary, those worries seemed to fade away. But it was too good to last. The trouble came on a gray October morning when the first snow was dusting the peaks. Ruth was in the kitchen, kneading dough, when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Matthew appeared in the doorway within seconds, his face grim. "Take Emma and go to the bedroom," he said quietly. "Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "What's wrong?" Ruth asked, but she was already moving. "I don't know yet," Matthew replied, reaching for the rifle above the fireplace. "But we're about to find out." Ruth had just reached the bedroom when she heard voices in the yard outside, loud and aggressive. "Turner!" a man's voice shouted. We know you're in there. Come out and face what you've done. Ruth's blood ran cold. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make out what was being said. She heard the cabin door open and Matthew's voice, calm despite the obvious threat. What do you want, Harrison? You know what we want, the other man replied, hatred clear in his voice. We want justice for what you did to our brother. Your brother was a murderer and a thief, Matthew said evenly. He got exactly what he deserved. He was trying to make an honest living, and you killed him in cold blood. I killed him in self-defense, Matthew corrected. After he drew on me, there were witnesses. Witnesses who were too scared of you to tell the truth. It's the truth. But we're not scared, Turner. We've come to settle the score. Ruth's heart was pounding. She could hear Emma stirring in her arms, sensing her mother's distress. There's no score to settle, Matthew said. Your brother made his choice when he decided to cheat grieving families. I made mine when I decided to stop him. By putting a bullet in his back. In his chest, Matthew corrected, while he was facing me with a gun in his hand. Ruth pressed closer to the door. She was beginning to understand what had happened, the confrontation that had made Matthew a marked man. Enough talk, one of the men growled. We didn't come here to debate. We came here to finish this. Then you came here to date, Matthew said simply. There's 4 of us and 1 of you. Turner, I like our chances. 4 against 1 does seem unfair, Matthew agreed. For you. Despite her fear, Ruth almost smiled at the dry humor in his voice. Before you do something you'll regret, Matthew said, steel in his voice now. You should know that there's a woman and baby in this cabin. Whatever quarrel you have with me, they're innocent. A woman, one of the men asked with surprise. That widow from town, another voice said. The one who was auctioned off. Turner bought her. Ruth's cheeks burned with shame at the crude way they spoke of her situation. Even better, the leader said with cruel satisfaction. When we're done with you, Turner, maybe we'll see what other debts need to be collected. The threat was unmistakable, and Ruth felt her blood turn to ice. That was a mistake, Matthew said quietly, and something in his voice made Ruth shiver. A big mistake. The first gunshot came without warning, followed immediately by 2 more. Ruth bit her lip to keep from crying out, clutching Emma so tightly that the baby finally woke with a startled wail. More shots followed, and Ruth sank to the floor with her daughter, pressing herself against the wall and praying harder than she had ever prayed. The shooting seemed to go on forever, though it probably lasted only minutes. Ruth heard men shouting, horses neighing in fear, the crash of something heavy falling. Through it all, she kept waiting for the sound that would tell her Matthew was down, but that sound never came. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, she heard Matthew's voice calling her name. Ruth, it's over. You can come out now. Ruth struggled to her feet, her legs shaking badly. Emma was crying in earnest now. With trembling hands, Ruth unlocked the bedroom door and stepped out. Matthew stood in the doorway, his rifle in his hands and his clothes torn in several places. There was blood on his shirt, but he was upright and alert. Are you hurt? Ruth asked, rushing to his side. Just a graze, Matthew replied, though she could see the pain he was trying to hide. Nothing serious. Are you all right? Is Emma? We're fine, Ruth assured him. What happened? 2 of them are dead. Matthew said grimly. The other 2 rode off. I don't think they'll be back. Ruth looked past him into the yard and immediately wished she hadn't. She could see bodies lying motionless in the dirt. I'm sorry you had to see this, Matthew said gently. I'm sorry you had to be here at all. It's not your fault, Ruth said quickly. They came here looking for trouble. You were defending us. Matthew nodded, but she could see the weight of what had happened settling on his shoulders. I need to take care of the bodies, Matthew said, and tend to my shoulder. Can you manage Emma for a while? Of course, Ruth replied, but let me look at that wound first. Matthew started to protest, then seemed to realize the futility of it. He allowed Ruth to help him out of his torn shirt, revealing a deep graze along his left shoulder. This needs to be cleaned and bandaged, Ruth said. Sit down and let me tend to it. As she worked, Ruth found herself thinking about what the men had said. They had called Matthew a killer, but the man sitting patiently while she tended his wound bore no resemblance to the monster they had described. Matthew, she said softly, What really happened with their brother? Matthew was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. His name was Jake Harrison, he said. He came to town about 4 years ago, set himself up as a traveling medicine man, claimed he had cures for everything. Ruth nodded, encouraging him to continue. When Sarah and Mary got sick, Matthew went on, I was desperate. The doctor said there was nothing he could do, but Harrison said he had medicine that could save them, guaranteed to cure consumption or your money back. But it didn't work, Ruth said softly. It was nothing but colored water and alcohol, Matthew replied bitterly. $50 for 2 bottles of useless liquid while my wife and daughter died in agony. And when I confronted Harrison about it, he laughed in my face. Ruth could imagine the scene, the grieving husband faced with the man who had profited from his family's suffering. He told me I was a fool for believing in miracle cures, Matthew continued. Said if I was stupid enough to trust a stranger with my family's lives, then I deserved what I got. That's when I lost my temper. And he drew a gun on you, Ruth said. He did, Matthew confirmed, right there in the middle of Main Street, with half the town watching. I was faster. So you were defending yourself, Ruth said firmly. That's what the law said. En bas c'est dit, Matthew replied, but the Harrison brothers never accepted it. They've been hunting me ever since from us. Ruth finished with the bandage and sat back. She was beginning to understand so much about him now. I'm not sorry you killed him, Ruth said quietly. Men like that who prey on people's desperation, they deserve whatever they get. Matthew looked at her with surprise. Most people don't see it that way. Most people haven't watched their loved ones suffer while charlatans get rich off false hope, Ruth replied. I have. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. What happens now? She asked eventually. Now we bury the dead and get ready for winter, Matthew replied pragmatically. The other 2 Harrison brothers might come back, but not until spring. These mountains are no place for a war party once the snow starts flying. And after spring, Matthew met her eyes directly. We'll face whatever comes, he said simply. Together. The first real snowfall came 3 days later, blanketing the mountains in pristine white and effectively cutting them off from the outside world until spring. Ruth watched from the cabin window as Matthew made his final preparations for winter. The 2 bodies from the gunfight had been buried in a small clearing beyond the barn. Emma was thriving in the mountain air, growing plumper and more alert with each passing day. She had taken to Matthew with surprising ease, gurgling happily whenever he held her and reaching for his face with tiny, curious fingers. She's going to be walking before we know it, Matthew said one evening as they sat by the fire, Emma playing contentedly on a blanket between them. She's already trying to roll over, Ruth observed. I think she's going to be an active child. Good, Matthew said with a smile. These mountains are no place for a timid soul. Ruth looked at him curiously. Do you think we'll still be here when she's old enough to walk? It was a question that had been weighing on her mind for days. Their arrangement had been for her indenture, a temporary solution. But as the weeks passed and their life together became more natural, Ruth found herself hoping it might become permanent. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. Do you want to be? He asked finally. I think so, Ruth replied honestly. I never expected to feel so at home anywhere again after David died. But this place, this life, it feels right somehow. Even after what happened with the Harrison brothers? Even knowing there might be more trouble come spring? Ruth considered the question seriously. The violence had been shocking, but it had also shown her something important about Matthew. He was dangerous when he needed to be, but only to those who threatened the people he cared about. Especially after that, she said firmly. You could have sent us away when you knew there might be trouble. But you didn't. You kept us here and protected us. I couldn't send you away, Matthew said quietly. Not into the winter, and not back to a town where you'd be at the mercy of men who see you as property. Is that the only reason? Ruth asked, her heart beating faster. Matthew looked at her then, his blue eyes intense. You know it's not, he said softly. You and Emma, you've brought something back to this place that I thought was gone forever. You've made it feel like a home again. You've given us a home too, Ruth said. More than that, you have given us safety and dignity, and the chance to be a family again. Is that what we are? Matthew asked. A family? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility. Ruth looked down at Emma, who had finally managed to roll over and was now regarding them both with bright eyes. Then she looked back at Matthew. I'd like to be, she said simply. Matthew's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. So would I, he admitted, more than I ever thought possible. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. I know this isn't conventional, he said. I know we haven't known each other long, and I know my past makes me dangerous to be associated with. But Ruth, I haven't felt this alive, this hopeful, since before Sarah and Mary died. I haven't felt this safe since before David got sick, Ruth replied, squeezing his hand. You've shown me kindness when I expected hardship. You've treated Emma like she was your own daughter. She feels like my own daughter, Matthew said, his voice thick with emotion. And you feel like... Like what? Ruth prompted gently. Like the woman I was meant to find, Matthew finished. Like the missing piece of my life. Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy. I love you, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I know it's too soon, but I love you, Matthew Turner. I love you too, Matthew replied without hesitation. I love your strength and your courage and the way you've made this cabin feel like a real home. Why would I be afraid of you? Ruth asked when he mentioned his reputation. Because I'm a killer, Matthew said bluntly. You're a protector, Ruth corrected firmly. You've killed bad men who threatened innocent people. That's not the behavior of a dangerous man. That's the behavior of a good man who's been through terrible things. I want to marry you, Matthew said suddenly. I know it's crazy. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but Ruth, I want to make this official. Ruth's heart soared. How? She asked practically. We're snowed in until spring. There's a circuit preacher who comes through these mountains every summer, Matthew said eagerly. Pastor Williams. If you're willing to wait until summer. I'm sure, Ruth said without hesitation. I've never been more sure of anything. Matthew lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then we'll consider ourselves engaged, he said, and come summer, we'll make it official. Emma chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, as if she approved. Both adults laughed, and Matthew scooped the baby up, holding her high above his head while she giggled with delight. What do you think, little one? He asked her. Do you want me to be your papa? Emma reached for his face with both hands, grabbing his nose and babbling something that sounded remarkably like agreement. I think that's a yes, Ruth said, wiping tears from her cheeks. Then it's settled, Matthew declared. We're going to be a family, a real family. As winter closed in around their mountain sanctuary, Ruth found herself marveling at the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow facing destitution. Now she was an engaged woman living in a beautiful cabin with a man who loved her and treated her daughter as his own. There would be challenges ahead, but for now, surrounded by warmth and love and the promise of a future together, Ruth Smith was the happiest she had ever been. Winter settled over the mountains like a thick, white blanket. The cabin became their entire world, woozy and warm while the wind howled outside and snow piled higher against the windows. Ruth had never experienced such isolation, but rather than feeling trapped, she found herself reveling in the intimate domesticity of their shared life. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Matthew would rise before dawn to tend the animals, while Ruth prepared breakfast and cared for Emma. They would eat together by the fire, talking quietly about their plans for spring. After breakfast, Matthew would work on indoor projects while Ruth managed the household tasks. Emma was growing rapidly, becoming more alert and interactive. She had learned to sit up on her own and was making determined efforts to crawl, much to Matthew's delight. He had taken to spending hours on the floor with her, encouraging her attempts at mobility. She's going to be walking before the snow melts, Ruth observed one afternoon. Good thing too, Matthew replied with a grin. By then she'll need the exercise. Spring also meant the return of potential danger. The Harrison brothers were still out there somewhere, nursing their grievances. Ruth tried not to think about it too much, but sometimes she would catch Matthew staring out the window with a distant, worried expression. Do you think they'll really come back? Ruth asked one evening. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. I think they'll try, he said finally. Men like that, they can't let go of a grudgance. How many of them are there? 3 more, last I heard, Matthew replied, plus whatever friends they can convince to join them. Ruth felt a chill. What will we do if they come? Same thing we did last time, Matthew said calmly. But Ruth, if there's real trouble, I want you to take Emma and get to the root cellar behind the cabin. There's supplies there, and it's hidden well enough that they might not find you even if— Even if what? Ruth demanded. Even if something happens to me, Matthew finished quietly. Nothing's going to happen to you, Ruth said fiercely. We're going to face whatever comes together. Matthew set down his carving and reached for her hand. Ruth, I need you to understand something. These men won't give up. They'll keep coming until either they're dead or I am. And I can't live with the thought of losing you, Ruth replied. Matthew, you saved us. You gave us a home and a family and a future. I'm not going to let some vengeful criminals take that away. You might not have a choice, Matthew said gently. There's always a choice, Ruth insisted, and I choose to fight for what we have. Matthew stared at her with something like wonder. You're remarkable, he said softly. Most women would be begging me to run. I'm not most women, Ruth replied. And this is our home now. I'm not running from it. Matthew brought her hand to his lips. I love you, he said simply. I love you too, Ron replied. And that's why we're going to get through this. Together. The conversation was interrupted by Emma waking with a soft cry. Ruth rose to tend to her, but Matthew was already there, lifting the baby from her cradle. Hey there, sweetheart, he murmured, settling Emma against his shoulder. Did we wake you? Emma gurgled and reached for his face. Matthew chuckled and began walking slowly around the room, rocking her back to sleep. Ruth watched them together, her heart full of love and determination. This was her family now. She would do whatever it took to protect them. The weeks passed slowly, marked by the gradual lengthening of days. Emma celebrated her first Christmas with them, though she was too young to understand. Ruth and Matthew exchanged simple gifts, practical things they had made during the long winter evenings. Matthew had carved Ruth a beautiful wooden jewelry box. Ruth had knitted Matthew a warm sweater. It's perfect, Matthew said as he tried on the sweater. I've never owned anything so fine. You deserve fine things, Ruth replied. You deserve to be cared for. I am cared for, Matthew said, pulling her into his arms. More than I ever dreamed possible. They kissed then, soft and sweet, while Emma played contentedly nearby. It was a perfect moment, Ruth thought, the kind she would remember for the rest of her life. As January melted into February and February gave way to March, the signs of approaching spring became more pronounced. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of brown earth and the first tentative green shoots. The days grew longer and warmer, and Ruth found herself able to spend more time outside. Emma was crawling now, getting into everything and requiring constant supervision. She had also begun to babble more deliberately, and Ruth was convinced she had heard her say Mama and Papa on several occasions. She's trying to talk, Ruth said one afternoon as they watched Emma pull herself up using the coffee table. Papa, Emma said clearly, looking directly at Matthew. Matthew's face lit up with pure joy. Did you hear that? She said Papa. I told you so, Ruth said, laughing at his excitement. Matthew scooped Emma up and spun her around. That's right, sweetheart, he said. I'm your papa, and you're my little girl. Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched them together. Emma had never known her biological father, but Matthew had stepped into that role with such natural ease. Mama, Emma said then, reaching for Ruth. Yes, baby, Ruth said, taking her daughter. Mama's here. It was a moment of perfect happiness, the three of them together with spring awakening, them and their wedding just a few months away. Ruth allowed herself to believe that this was how their life would always be, safe, peaceful, filled with love and the simple joys of family life. But even as she held Emma close and felt Matthew's arm around her shoulders, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that their idyllic winter was coming to an end. Soon the mountain passes would be clear. Soon the outside world would intrude on their sanctuary once again. Soon the Harrison brothers would come calling. The first sign of trouble came on a warm April morning when Matthew returned from checking his trap lines with a grim expression and news that made Ruth's blood run cold. There are tracks, he said without preamble, setting his rifle against the wall. Fresh horse tracks on the old mining trail, heading this way. Ruth felt Emma slip from her nerveless fingers and had to grab quickly to keep her daughter from tumbling to the floor. How fresh? She asked. Yesterday, maybe the day before, Matthew replied, already moving toward the window. 5 horses, moving slow and careful. They're scouting. The Harrison brothers, Ruth said, and it wasn't a question. Has to be, Matthew confirmed. I've been expecting them since the snow started melting. Ruth set Emma down and moved to stand beside Matthew at the window. The forest looked peaceful and normal, but somewhere out there, men with guns and hatred were planning an attack on everything she held dear. What do we do? She asked. We get ready, Matthew said simply. Check our supplies. Make sure we have everything we need for a siege. Ruth looked around the cabin with new eyes, noticing for the first time the thick log walls, the small windows that would be difficult for attackers to breach, the strategic positioning that gave clear views of all approaches. What about Emma? Ruth asked, voicing her greatest fear. She'll be safest right here with us, Matthew replied. The cabin's solid, and I've got enough ammunition to hold off an army if I have to. How many of them do you think there are? Hard to say from the tracks. Could be bus, could be more tall. Ruth nodded, trying to process this information calmly. 5 armed men against 1, even a man as skilled as Matthew. The odds were not good. What can I do to help? She asked. Matthew looked at her with surprise and something that might have been pride. You want to help fight? This is my home too, Ruth said firmly. My family. I'm not going to cower in a corner while you face them alone. Can you shoot? Matthew asked. David taught me, Ruth replied. I'm not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at. Matthew nodded thoughtfully. There's a shotgun in the bedroom closet. If they get past me, if they somehow make it inside the cabin, you use that. Don't hesitate. Don't try to wound them. These men are here to kill us, Ruth. All of us. The blunt words sent a chill through Ruth, but she forced herself to nod. I understand. I hope you never have to use it, Matthew said gently. But if the time comes, I need to know you'll do whatever it takes. I will, Ruth promised, whatever it takes. They spent the rest of the day preparing for battle. Matthew checked and cleaned his weapons, counted ammunition, and made sure all the shutters were secure. Ruth prepared food that could be eaten cold if necessary, filled every available container with water, and moved all of Emma's supplies to the most protected part of the cabin. As evening approached, they ate a quiet dinner by lamplight. The shutters closed tight. Emma seemed to sense the tension and was fussier than usual. She knows something's wrong, Ruth observed. Animals always know, Matthew agreed. As if summoned by his words, one of the horses whinnied loudly from the barn, followed by the sound of hooves stamping nervously. Matthew was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Stay here, he said quietly. Keep Emma quiet. But before he could reach the door, the sound of gunfire erupted from outside. Not the measured shots of a hunting party, but the rapid, chaotic barrage of men trying to kill each other. Matthew threw himself against the wall beside the window, peering carefully through a gap in the shutters. They're here, he said grimly. Looks like they decided not to wait for morning. More shots rang out, followed by the sound of men shouting orders and horses neighing in terror. Ruth clutched Emma close, her heart pounding. How many? She whispered. I count at least 6, Matthew replied. Maybe more. They've got the cabin surrounded. A voice called out from the darkness, harsh and filled with hatred. Turner, we know you're in there. Come out and face us like a man. Matthew moved to a different window. I'm right here, Harrison, he called back. If you want me, come and get me. We will, but first we're going to burn you out. Ruth felt her blood turn to ice. Fire was the one thing they hadn't prepared for. They're bluffing, Matthew said, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. A new sound reached them then, the crackle and roar of flames. Ruth smelled smoke and saw an orange glow beginning to flicker through the gaps in the shutters. The barn, Matthew said grimly. They've set the barn on fire. The horses' screams of terror were horrible to hear, and Ruth knew that Matthew was torn between staying to protect them and going to save the animals. You have to let them go, she said softly. The horses. You have to save yourself. Matthew's jaw was tight with anguish, but he nodded. The horses would have to fend for themselves. The attack began in earnest then, bullets slamming into the log walls and shattering the few unshuttered windows. Matthew moved from position to position, returning fire whenever he could identify a target. There, he said suddenly, taking careful aim. His rifle cracked, and someone outside screamed in pain. You got one of them, Ruth said, trying to keep Emma calm as the baby cried in terror. One down, 5 to go, Matthew replied grimly, already moving to a new position. But Ruth could see that the situation was hopeless. There were too many attackers, and they had the cabin completely surrounded. Matthew, she said quietly, we need to get out of here. Not yet, he replied, firing again. As long as we're inside, we have cover. In here, we're trapped, Ruth countered. At least outside, we have a chance to run. Another volley of shots rang out, and this time Ruth heard the distinctive crack of wood splintering. The attackers were concentrating their fire on the door. The root cellar, Matthew said suddenly, there's a tunnel that leads from the cellar to the creek. I dug it years ago, just in case. Then let's go, Ruth said, already gathering Emma's things. Matthew fired one more shot and then grabbed his rifle and the bag of ammunition. Stay low, he warned, and whatever happens, don't stop moving. They made their way to the back of the cabin where a trap door led down to the root cellar. Matthew lifted the heavy wooden panel, revealing a ladder that disappeared into darkness below. You first, he said. I'll cover our retreat. Ruth clutched Emma tightly and started down the ladder. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of earth and stored vegetables, but she could feel a draft of cool air that suggested the tunnel Matthew had mentioned. This way! Matthew's voice came from above her, and then he was dropping down into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed behind them. In the darkness, Ruth heard him moving around, and then a match flared to life. By its flickering light, she could see the tunnel entrance, a narrow opening that had been carefully concealed behind the stacks of preserved food. It's tight, Matthew warned, but it leads to the creek about 50 yards from here. Once we're outside, we head for the high country. Ruth nodded, though she wondered if it would ever truly be over. Would they spend the rest of their lives running? But there was no time for such thoughts now. Matthew was already crawling into the tunnel, his rifle cradled in his arms. Ruth followed, Emma pressed against her chest, trying not to think about the tons of earth above their heads. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, narrow and claustrophobic, filled with the sound of their labored breathing and Emma's frightened whimpers. But finally, Ruth saw a glimmer of starlight ahead, and then they were emerging into the cool night air beside the rushing creek. We made it, Matthew said softly, helping Ruth to her feet. But even as he spoke, they heard shouts from the direction of the cabin. Their escape had been discovered, and the hunt was about to begin. The forest at night was a maze of shadows and uncertain footing. Matthew led the way, moving with sure-footed confidence. Ruth followed as quietly as she could, Emma clutched against her chest, the baby's breathing the loudest sound in the world despite her efforts to keep her daughter calm. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer. Shouts and curses as the Harrison brothers discovered the tunnel, the crash of boots through underbrush, the occasional crack of a rifle as someone fired at shadows. This way, Matthew whispered, leading them up a steep slope covered in loose rocks and fallen logs. There's a game trail that leads to the caves. A gunshot rang out, much closer than before, and Ruth heard the distinctive whine of a bullet passing overhead. Someone had seen them, or at least seen movement in the darkness. Run! Run! Matthew said urgently, no longer worried about stealth. Just run! Ruth stumbled forward, her legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. Emma was crying now, her frightened wails echoing through the forest like a beacon for their pursuers. There was no way to keep her quiet, no way to hide their location. There they are, a voice shouted from below. I see them on the ridge. More gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Ruth felt bark explode from a tree beside her head and realized with crystal clarity that these men were trying to kill her as well as Matthew. They didn't care that she was a woman carrying a baby. The realization filled her with rage rather than fear. How dare they threaten her daughter? How dare they try to destroy the family she and Matthew had worked so hard to build? The cave's just ahead, Matthew called back to her. 50 more yards. but 50 yards might as well have been 50 miles. Ruth's legs were giving out, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Emma's weight seemed to double with each step. "I can't," she gasped, stumbling over a fallen log. "Matthew, I can't keep up." He was beside her instantly, his strong arms supporting her weight. "Yes, you can," he said firmly. "You're the strongest woman I know, Ruth Smith. You've survived everything life has thrown at you, and you're going to survive this too." His confidence gave her strength, and she forced herself to keep moving. One step, then another. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers grew closer, but ahead she could see the dark mouth of a cave opening in the rocky cliff face. "Almost there," Matthew encouraged. "Just a little farther." They reached the cave entrance, just as another volley of shots rang out from below. Matthew pushed Ruth inside first, then followed, his rifle ready as he took position near the opening. "How deep does it go?" Ruth asked, trying to catch her breath. "Deep enough," Matthew replied. "And there's another all about it we need it. But for now, we're safe. They can't rush us without exposing themselves." Ruth looked around the cave, her eyes slowly adjusting to the deeper darkness. It was larger than she had expected, with several chambers branching off from the main entrance. Someone had been here before, she realized, noting the remains of old campfires and what looked like stored supplies. "You've used this place before," she observed. "A few times," Matthew admitted. "It's a good hideout, yeah." "How long can we stay here?" "As long as we have to," Matthew replied. "There's a spring in the back chamber, and enough supplies to last a week or more." As if in answer to his question, a voice called out from the forest below. "Turner, we know you're up there. You cannot hide forever." "Watch me," Matthew called back. "We've got all the time in the world. But that baby of yours is going to get hungry eventually. You going to let her starve just to save your own skin?" Ruth felt her heart clench at the cruel words. These men would use Emma's needs against them, would try to force them out by threatening the welfare of an innocent child. "Don't listen to them," Matthew said quietly. "They're trying to get inside your head." "What if they're right?" Ruth whispered. "What if we can't stay here long enough?" "Then we'll find another way," Matthew replied with quiet determination. "But I'm not letting them have you, Ruth. Not you and not Emma. Whatever it takes." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Ruth tried to keep Emma comfortable and quiet, nursing her when she grew fussy and singing soft lullabies. Matthew kept watch at the cave entrance, his rifle ready, occasionally exchanging taunts with the men below. As dawn approached, Ruth could see the exhaustion in Matthew's face, the strain of staying alert for hours on end. "Let me take a turn," she offered. "You need to rest." "I'm fine," Matthew replied automatically. "No, you're not," Ruth said firmly. "You're dead on your feet. Let me watch for a while." Matthew started to protest, then seemed to realize the wisdom in her words. "Can you shoot from this position?" "If I have to," Ruth replied, taking the rifle from his hands. It was heavier than she remembered, but she managed to brace it against the cave wall. "Wake me if anything changes," Matthew said, settling down against the cave wall. "Anything at all." Within minutes, he was asleep. Ruth watched over him and Emma both, her heart full of fierce protectiveness. These were her people now, her family, and she would defend them with her life if necessary. The sun rose slowly over the mountains, revealing the full extent of their situation. Ruth could see at least 4 men positioned around the base of the cliff, their rifles trained on the cave entrance. They had built a small fire and were cooking breakfast, clearly prepared for a long siege. "Morning, Mrs. Turner," one of them called out mockingly. "How'd you sleep?" Ruth didn't respond, but the casual use of Matthew's name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Turner. It had a nice ring to it. "We brought plenty of food. How about you? That baby getting hungry yet?" Ruth gritted her teeth and forced herself not to respond. They were trying to provoke her. Emma stirred in her arms, making the soft mewing sounds that meant she was waking up. Ruth quickly moved deeper into the cave, hoping to muffle any noise her daughter might make. "I hear that baby crying," the voice called out triumphantly. "She's hungry, isn't she? You can't feed her forever on what you've got up there." The cruel words hit their mark, and Ruth felt tears of frustration and fear prick at her eyes. How long could they hold out? How long before Emma's needs forced them to surrender? But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Ruth remembered something Matthew had said the night before. There was another way out of the cave, another route they could take if the situation became desperate. Maybe it was time to explore that option. Ruth waited until Emma had settled back to sleep, then carefully made her way deeper into the cave system. Matthew had mentioned a spring in the back chamber, and where there was water, there might also be another exit. She found the spring exactly where Matthew had indicated, a small pool of crystal clear water bubbling up from some underground source. But more importantly, she could feel a definite breeze coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system, suggesting an opening to the outside world. Following the air current, Ruth made her way through a narrow passage that opened into another chamber. Here, she could see actual daylight filtering down from above, and when she looked up, she spotted what appeared to be a natural chimney leading to the surface. It was too narrow for an adult to climb, but it might be possible to get a message through. Or better yet, it might provide an escape route for someone small enough to fit through the opening. Ruth hurried back to the main chamber, her mind racing with possibilities. Matthew was still sleeping, and Emma was content in her makeshift bed of blankets. Matthew, Ruth whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. Wake up, I found something. Matthew's eyes snapped open instantly, his hand reaching automatically for his rifle. What is it? Are they coming? No, Ruth said quickly, but I found another way out. Or at least, I think I did. She quickly explained what she had discovered in the back chamber. Watching as Matthew's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that might have been hope. Show me, he said, rising stiffly to his feet. They made their way through the cave system together, Emma sleeping peacefully in Ruth's arms. When they reached the chamber with the natural chimney, Matthew studied the opening carefully. It's narrow, he said finally, but it might work. The question is, where does it come out? Only one way to find out, Ruth replied. Matthew nodded thoughtfully. If we could get you and Emma out through there, you could make your way down the back side of the mountain. There's a settlement about 10 miles south, people who would help you. What about you? Ruth asked, though she already knew the answer. I stay here, Matthew said simply. Keep them focused on the cave while you escape. No, Ruth said firmly. We stay together. That was the plan, remember? Ruth, be reasonable, Matthew said gently. This is our best chance to get you and Emma to safety. And I can't live with myself if I abandon you, Ruth replied stubbornly. There has to be another way. They were interrupted by a new voice from outside the cave, different from the others they had heard. This one was older, more authoritative, with the kind of confidence that came from command. Turner, the voice called out. This is Sheriff Morrison from Pine Ridge. I want to talk. Matthew's expression shifted to one of surprise and something that might have been relief. Morrison, he said softly. I didn't expect him to get involved. You know him? Ruth asked. He's a good man, Matthew replied. Fair, honest. If he's here, it might mean we have a chance to end this without more bloodshed. They made their way back to the cave entrance, where Matthew positioned himself to speak with the sheriff while remaining protected from the other gunmen. Morrison, Matthew called out, what brings you all the way up here? Got word there was trouble brewing, the sheriff replied. Thought I'd better come see what all the fuss was about before someone got killed. Someone already did get killed, one of the Harrison brothers interjected angrily. This murderer shot down our brother in cold blood. I heard about that, Morrison said calmly. I also heard there were witnesses who said it was self-defense. Lies, the brother spat. All lies. Maybe so, Morrison replied evenly, but that's for a court to decide, not a lynch mob. Turner, you willing to come down and discuss this like civilized men? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Ruth could see the conflict in his face, the desire to end the standoff peacefully warring with his knowledge of what the Harrison brothers were capable of. What kind of guarantees can you offer? Matthew asked finally. Safe passage to town for a fair hearing, Morrison replied. My word as a lawman that you'll get your day in court. And what about my family? Matthew asked. The woman and child with me? They'll be protected too, Morrison promised. Whatever happens, they won't be harmed. Ruth felt a flicker of hope at the sheriff's words. Maybe there was a way out of this that didn't involve more violence. But even as she allowed herself to hope, She heard one of the Harrison brothers whisper something to his companions, something too low for her to make out but urgent and angry in tone. "I don't trust them," she said quietly to Matthew. "They're planning something." Matthew nodded grimly. "I know, but Morrison's a good man. If he says he'll protect us, he means it." "Can he protect us from 5 armed men who don't care about the law?" "We'll find out," Matthew replied, "because I don't see that we have much choice." Ruth wanted to argue, but she knew Matthew was right. Their supplies wouldn't last indefinitely, and Emma's needs would eventually force them out into the open regardless. "All right," Matthew called down to the sheriff. "I'm coming out, but I want your word that my family will be safe." "You have it," Morrison replied firmly. Matthew turned to Ruth, his blue eyes serious and full of love. "Whatever happens down there, I want you to know that these past months with you and Emma have been the happiest of my life." "Don't talk like that," Ruth said fiercely. "This isn't over. We're going to get through this, and then we're going to get married and raise Emma together and live happily ever after." Matthew smiled at her determination. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "That's exactly what we're going to do." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, while Emma gurgled contentedly between them. It was a moment of perfect love in the midst of chaos. "Ready?" Matthew asked. Ruth nodded, though her heart was pounding with fear. "Ready." They made their way to the cave entrance, Matthew leading with his rifle held in a non-threatening position. Ruth followed close behind, Emma in her arms, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. The morning sun was bright after the darkness of the cave, and Ruth had to squint to make out the figures waiting below. Sheriff Morrison was exactly as she had imagined him, a tall, graying man with kind eyes and a badge that caught the sunlight. The Harrison brothers and their allies were spread out around the clearing, their weapons still drawn despite the sheriff's presence. "That's far enough," Morrison said as Matthew emerged fully from the cave. "Now, let's talk about this like reasonable men." But even as the sheriff spoke, Ruth saw one of the Harrison brothers raise his rifle, his face twisted with hatred and the promise of violence. "Look out!" she screamed. The warning came just in time. Matthew threw himself to the side as the rifle cracked, the bullet chipping stone from the cave wall where his head had been a split second before. Sheriff Morrison spun around, his own weapon drawn, but the Harrison brothers were already in motion. "Stand down," Morrison shouted, his voice carrying the authority of years in law enforcement. "I said stand down." But the brothers were beyond listening to reason. They had come too far and lost too much to back down now. "He's a murderer," one of them screamed, firing wildly in Matthew's direction. "Justice demands blood." "The only justice here is what I say it is," Morrison replied, but his words were lost in the chaos as gunfire erupted from multiple positions. Ruth pressed herself against the cave wall, shielding Emma with her body as bullets whined overhead. Matthew had found cover behind a large boulder, his rifle answering the attackers shot for shot, but she could see that he was badly outnumbered. "Ruth," Matthew called out, "get back in the cave." But Ruth was done with hiding, done with being helpless, while others determined her fate. She had found her courage in the crucible of fear and desperation, and she wasn't going to waste it now. Moving quickly, she retreated just far enough into the cave to reach the shotgun Matthew had given her, then returned to the entrance where she could provide covering fire. The weapon was heavy and awkward in her hands, but she remembered David's lessons about stance and aim, and when one of the attackers exposed himself to get a better shot at Matthew, she was ready. The shotgun boomed like thunder, and the man spun around with a scream of pain and surprise. Ruth had aimed for his shoulder, not wanting to kill if she could avoid it, but the spread of the buckshot had caught him across the chest and arm, sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. "Good shot," Matthew called out, pride and admiration clear in his voice. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining attackers had realized that they were taking fire from multiple directions, and they were adapting their tactics accordingly. Ruth could see them moving to flank the cave entrance. "They're trying to get behind us," she warned. "I see them," Matthew replied, shifting position to cover the new threat. Sheriff Morrison was doing his best to restore order, but he was caught in the middle of a firefight between determined men who had no intention of surrendering. Ruth could see the frustration and anger in his face, as he tried to end the violence without getting killed in the process. "This has gone far enough," he shouted over the gunfire. "Everybody put down your weapons." One of the Harrison brothers answered by firing directly at the sheriff, the bullet passing close enough to tear through his hat. Morrison's expression hardened, and when he returned fire, it was with the deadly accuracy of a man who had finally run out of patience. The brother went down hard, clutching his leg and cursing, but his companions kept fighting. They were down to 3 men now, but they were the most dangerous 3, the ones with the most to lose and the least to live for. "Turner!" the eldest Harrison brother called out, his voice hoarse with rage and desperation. "End this now! Come out and face me like a man, one-on-one." "So you can shoot me down like a dog?" Matthew replied. "I don't think so." "Then we'll burn you out," the man threatened. "I've got enough kerosene to turn that whole cliff into an inferno." Ruth felt her blood turn cold at the threat. Fire was their greatest vulnerability, the one thing they couldn't defend against from inside the cave. But before anyone could act on the threat, a new sound reached them from the forest below. The thunder of hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast up the mountain trail. Ruth's heart leaped with hope. Reinforcements for the sheriff, perhaps. The Harrison brothers heard it too, and she could see the uncertainty in their faces as they tried to identify the approaching riders. The answer came as a group of 6 mounted men burst into the clearing, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Deputy sheriffs from Pine Ridge, armed and were ready for trouble. "About time," Sheriff Morrison called out with obvious relief. "These boys have been giving me more trouble than I bargained for." The arrival of additional lawmen changed the dynamic completely. Suddenly, the Harrison brothers found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, facing not just Matthew Turner and his family, but the full authority of the territorial government. "This is over," Morrison announced, his voice carrying new confidence. "You men throw down your weapons and surrender peacefully, or we'll take you down right here and now." For a moment, Ruth thought the eldest Harrison brother might actually comply. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the recognition that their cause was lost. But hatred won out over reason. With a wordless cry of rage, the man raised his rifle toward Matthew, determined to take his enemy with him, even if it cost his own life. Ruth didn't hesitate. The shotgun boomed again, and this time her aim was true. The Harrison brother crumpled to the ground, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. His quest for vengeance finally ended. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall, finally threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The long nightmare was over at last. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies moved quickly to secure the scene, tending to the wounded and arresting the survivors. Ruth found herself shaking with reaction as the adrenaline began to fade, the full impact of what had happened finally hitting her. "It's over," Matthew said softly, taking her in his arms. "It's finally over." Ruth leaned against his solid strength. Emma still clutched protectively in her arms. "Is it really?" she asked. "Are we safe now?" "As safe as anyone can be in this world," Matthew replied. "The Harrison brothers are finished, and Sheriff Morrison will make sure word gets out about what really happened here." Sheriff Morrison approached them then, his expression grave but not unkind. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said. "I was hoping to end it peacefully." "You tried," Matthew replied. "That's more than most lawmen would have done." "There'll have to be an inquiry, of course," Morrison continued. "Questions about what happened here, testimony from witnesses. But from what I saw, it was clear self-defense. You shouldn't have any legal troubles." Ruth felt a weight lift from her shoulders at the sheriff's words. No legal troubles meant they could finally start building the life they had dreamed of. "What about our cabin?" Ruth asked, suddenly remembering their home. "Burned to the ground, I'm afraid," Morrison replied gently. "But the barn and outbuildings are mostly intact. You can rebuild if you want to stay in these mountains." Ruth looked at Matthew, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. The cabin had been their sanctuary, their first home together, and losing it was painful. But it was just a building, after all. What mattered was that they were alive and together and free to build a new future. "We'll rebuild," Matthew said firmly. "This is our home now, our place. We're not going anywhere." Sheriff Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good. These mountains need people like you, people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right." As the lawmen prepared to leave with their prisoners, Ruth found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow facing destitution and the loss of her child. Now she was a woman who had fought for her family and won, who had found love and courage and a place to call home. No regrets? Matthew asked softly, as if reading her thoughts. Ruth looked around at the scene of their recent battle, at the burned remains of their cabin, visible in the distance, at the beautiful mountains that had become their sanctuary and their battlefield. Then she looked at Matthew, the strong, gentle man who had saved her and Emma and given them a future worth fighting for. No regrets, she said firmly. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. 3 months later, Ruth stood in the doorway of their new cabin, watching Matthew put the finishing touches on Emma's new cradle. The structure was larger than their original home, with better windows and a more efficient fireplace, built with the help of neighbors who had come from miles around to assist in the reconstruction. Emma was crawling everywhere now, getting into everything and keeping Ruth constantly busy. She had said her first clear words just the week before, calling Matthew Papa, with such obvious delight that he had nearly cried with joy. Almost finished, Matthew said, testing the cradle's smooth rocking motion, though I don't know how much longer she'll need it. She'll always need it for her dolls, Ruth replied with a smile, and maybe someday for her own babies. The thought of Emma grown up and married with children of her own filled Ruth with a bittersweet mixture of anticipation and melancholy. Speaking of babies, Matthew said casually, not looking up from his work, Pastor Williams will be coming through next month. I was thinking it might be a good time for that wedding we've been planning. Ruth felt her heart skip a beat. They had talked about marriage many times over the winter, but the events of spring had pushed their plans to the back burner while they focused on rebuilding their lives. Are you proposing to me, Matthew Turner? She asked with mock seriousness. I'm confirming our engagement, Matthew replied, finally looking up at her with eyes full of love and mischief. Unless you've changed your mind about marrying a dangerous mountain man. Never, Ruth said firmly, though I should warn you, you're getting a dangerous mountain woman in return. Matthew laughed, remembering her courage during the final confrontation with the Harrison brothers. I wouldn't have it any other way. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma crawled over to the cradle and pulled herself up to standing position, babbling excitedly at the beautiful carved designs. Matthew scooped her up, spinning her around until she giggled with delight. What do you think, sweetheart? He asked her. Should your mama and I get married? Papa, Emma said clearly, reaching for his face with both hands. I'll take that as a yes, Matthew said, kissing her chubby cheek. Ruth watched them together, her heart full to bursting with love and gratitude. The journey that had brought them together had been difficult and dangerous, marked by loss and hardship and the constant threat of violence. But it had also been a journey of discovery, of finding strength she didn't know she possessed and love she had never dared to hope for. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts, and Ruth felt a familiar flicker of anxiety. Would there always be that moment of fear when strangers approached? But these riders were friends, she realized with relief. Sheriff Morrison and his wife come for their monthly visit to check on the family and share news from the outside world. Afternoon, folks, Morrison called out as he dismounted. Hope we're not interrupting anything important. Just planning a wedding, Matthew replied with a grin. You and Mrs. Morrison are invited, of course. Wouldn't miss it, Morrison's wife said warmly. It's about time you two made it official. They spent a pleasant afternoon sharing news and gossip, discussing the changing seasons and the prospects for the coming winter. Morrison brought word that the surviving Harrison brothers had been sentenced to prison terms, and that no further trouble was expected from that quarter. You've become something of a legend in these parts, Morrison told Matthew, as they sat on the new front porch, watching Emma play in the yard, the mountain man who stood up to a gang of outlaws and lived to tell about it. I had help, Matthew replied, glancing meaningfully at Ruth. Couldn't have done it alone. No, I don't suppose you could have, Morrison agreed with a knowing smile. Takes a special kind of woman to face down armed men with a shotgun. Ruth felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and pride. She still couldn't quite believe she had found the courage to fight when it mattered most, but the experience had changed her in fundamental ways. She was no longer the desperate widow who had stood on that auction platform, helpless and afraid. She was a woman who had discovered her own strength, who had fought for her family and won. As evening approached and the Morrisons prepared to leave, Ruth found herself thinking about the future with anticipation rather than anxiety. There would be challenges ahead, certainly, but she and Matthew would face those challenges together, as partners and equals, bound by love and mutual respect. "I have something for you," Matthew said after their guests had departed, and Emma was settled in her new cradle for the night. He disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a small wooden box, beautifully carved with the same intricate designs that decorated Emma's cradle. "I made it for you," he said simply, placing the box in her hands. Ruth opened it with trembling fingers and gasped at what she found inside. A simple gold ring, clearly handmade but perfectly crafted, nestled in a bed of soft cloth. "It was my grandmother's gold," Matthew explained. "I had it melted down and reformed. I wanted you to have something that connected you to my family, to the history of this place." Ruth lifted the ring with reverent fingers, admiring the way it caught the firelight. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a perfect symbol of the love they had found in the wilderness. "Will you wear it?" Matthew asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know it's not much compared to what a woman might get in town, but—" "It's perfect," Ruth said firmly, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." The ring fit as if it had been made for her, which, in a way, it had been. Matthew had crafted it with his own hands, had put his love and hopes for their future into every careful stroke of the tools. "I love you," Ruth said softly, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you so much it sometimes takes my breath away." "I love you too," Matthew replied, leaning down to kiss her. "More than I ever thought possible." As they held each other in the firelight, Emma sleeping peacefully nearby, Ruth marveled at the strange turns life could take. A year ago, she had been facing the worst crisis of her life, convinced that her future held nothing but hardship and loss. Now she was engaged to a man who loved her completely, living in a home they had built together, raising a daughter who would grow up surrounded by love and security. The auction platform seemed like something from another lifetime, a nightmare that had led ultimately to the greatest blessing of her life. The desperate woman who had stood there, clutching her baby, facing separation and despair, had been transformed into someone stronger and more confident than she had ever imagined possible. "No one separates a mother from her child," Matthew had said that day, and his words had proven prophetic in ways neither of them could have foreseen. He hadn't just kept them together. He had made them part of something larger and more beautiful than either of them could have achieved alone. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of winter and the cycles of seasons yet to come. But inside their cabin, surrounded by love and warmth and the quiet contentment of family life, Ruth Smith Turner felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her home. The mountains had tested them, had demanded everything they had to give, and more. But they had proven themselves worthy of the sanctuary they had found, had earned their place in this wild and beautiful country through courage and determination, and an unshakable commitment to each other. As she drifted off to sleep in Matthew's arms, Ruth's last conscious thought was a prayer of thanksgiving for the man who had seen a desperate woman on an auction block and chosen compassion over convenience, love over solitude. He had saved her life in every way that mattered, and she had saved his in return. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and learn and build the life they had dreamed of. But tonight they were simply a family at peace, secure in their mountain sanctuary and in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. The story that had begun with an auction and a stranger's unexpected kindness had become something far greater, a testament to the power of love to transform lives and the courage of ordinary people to create extraordinary happiness in the most unlikely circumstances. Ruth Smith had found her home at last, not in a place but in the heart of a man who understood that some bonds could never be broken, some loves were worth any sacrifice, and some families were forged not by blood, but by choice and commitment in the simple decision to stand together against whatever storms might come.